The bus doesn't arrive with sirens. There is no announcement, no warning, just steel doors and silence. For most inmates, a prison transfer means adjustment, a new cell, new rules, a new routine. But in Texas, a death row transfer means something very different. It means the end of movement, the end of normal human contact, and for many, the beginning of a psychological countdown that never stops. Once the paperwork is signed and the chains are secured, the inmate is no longer just serving time. They are entering a system designed for finality. From that moment forward, every step is controlled. Every sound is monitored. Every day follows the same unchanging pattern. The cell becomes the world. The door becomes a boundary between life and disappearance. In Texas, death row is not just a housing unit. It is a process built on isolation, routine, and waiting for appeals, waiting for court decisions, waiting for dates that may change or suddenly appear without warning. For some inmates, that wait lasts years. For others, decades. But no matter how long it takes, the transfer itself is the point of no return. This documentary reveals what really happens after a death row transfer in Texas. Not the myths, not the headlines, but the reality inside the walls. How inmates are received, what they're allowed to keep, what they lose immediately, and how the system reshapes the mind long before an execution ever takes place. Because once the door closes behind them, there is no way back. And everything that follows is designed to remind them of exactly where they are. Pause. Beat of silence. Low ambient sound fades, and this is life after the transfer. This is Texas death row. And this is what they don't show you. The transfer that changes everything. The transfer to death row in Texas does not begin with a dramatic announcement. There is no courtroom speech. No final warning. For most inmates, it starts quietly, with paperwork, restraints, and a schedule that offers no explanation. Once an individual has exhausted enough of the legal process to be officially assigned to death row housing, responsibility shifts fully to the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, commonly known as TDCJ. From that moment on, the inmate is no longer treated as part of the general prison population. Their classification changes, their movement privileges end, and their world begins to shrink. The transfer itself is tightly controlled. Inmates are typically moved in secure prison transport vehicles, restrained at the wrists, waist, and ankles. The goal is not speed or comfort. It is containment. Transfers are scheduled to minimize exposure to other inmates and the public. There are no windows, no sense of direction. For the inmate inside, time becomes vague, marked only by the sound of the engine and the pressure of the restraints. For some, this ride lasts a few hours. For others, much longer. But regardless of distance, every transfer ends the same way, at a death row facility where life will follow a completely different set of rules. Arrival without ceremony. Arrival at a Texas death row unit is deliberately uneventful. There is no orientation video, no welcoming officer, no explanation of what comes next. The inmate is removed from the transport vehicle and escorted through secured sally ports, layered checkpoints designed to ensure no unauthorized movement. Each gate closes before the next opens. The process is slow by design. Inside, the inmate is processed immediately. Personal property is stripped down to essentials, items that were once allowed in general population. Extra clothing, photographs beyond a limited number, commissary privileges, are reduced or removed entirely. What remains is logged, stored, or destroyed, depending on policy. The message is clear from the start. This is not a temporary placement. Classification and isolation. After intake, the inmate is officially reclassified as a death row offender. This classification overrides nearly all previous status levels. In Texas, death row inmates are housed in single-person cells. There is no cellmate, no shared space. Interaction with other inmates is extremely limited and often non-existent. Cells are small, typically concrete with a solid steel door. Some doors contain narrow windows, others do not. Furnishings are minimal, a bed, a toilet sink combination, and a writing surface fixed to the wall. The door remains closed for the majority of the day. On Texas death row, inmates spend approximately 22 to 24 hours per day inside their cells. Recreation, when allowed, occurs alone, often in enclosed areas with no view of the outside world. This level of isolation is not accidental. It is policy. Officials argue it is necessary for security, given the crimes associated with death row inmates. But former staff, psychologists, and inmates themselves have described the psychological effects as severe and cumulative. From the first night onward, silence becomes a constant presence. The first night on death row is often described as the most disorienting. Lights remain on or dimmed, depending on the unit. Sounds echo, distant doors slamming, the hum of ventilation systems, footsteps that stop without warning. There is no clear sense of time. For inmates who previously lived in general population, the absence of human noise can be unsettling. Conversations are replaced by echoes. Routine is replaced by waiting. Many inmates report sleeping poorly during their first weeks. Some stop sleeping altogether. This is when the reality of the transfer begins to settle in, not the idea of execution. That may still feel distant, but the realization that this environment is permanent. Daily life begins. By the second day, routine takes over. Meals are delivered through slots in the cell door. Communication with staff is brief and functional. There are no casual conversations. Every interaction is documented. Movement outside the cell occurs only under escort and only when scheduled. Showers, recreation, medical visits, all are conducted individually. Inmates are restrained any time they leave the cell. Male privileges exist but are heavily monitored. Phone calls are rare and tightly regulated. Visits, when allowed, occur behind glass with no physical contact. For many inmates, this marks the beginning of a long-term pattern. Days that blend together, distinguished only by count times and meal deliveries. The psychological shift. The most profound change after a death row transfer is not physical. It is mental. Psychologists have long noted that extreme isolation alters perception. On Texas death row, inmates are cut off not just from society, but from normal social reinforcement. There is no feedback loop, no casual interaction, no shared experience. Over time, this can lead to anxiety, depression, hallucinations, and emotional numbness. Some inmates talk to themselves. Others cling to rigid routines, exercise schedules, reading patterns, prayer, as a way to impose structure on an environment that offers none. The knowledge of execution adds another layer of pressure. Even without a scheduled date, the possibility hangs over every day. Legal appeals may take years, but they can also end abruptly. In Texas, executions can be scheduled with relatively short notice once appeals are exhausted. That uncertainty becomes part of daily life. No path back. One of the most difficult aspects of a Texas death row transfer is understanding that there is no return to general population. Even inmates who have their convictions overturned or sentences modified may spend years in death row conditions while legal processes unfold. The system moves slowly and always in favor of security. For most inmates, death row is not just a holding area. It is the final environment they will ever know. The transfer marks the moment when the prison stops being a place of punishment and becomes a place of waiting. Waiting for appeals. Waiting for decisions. Waiting for time to pass. The end of the beginning. By the end of the first week, most inmates understand the reality of their situation. The transfer is over. The doors are locked. The routine is fixed. What comes next is not dramatic. There are no constant confrontations or violent outbursts. Instead, there's repetition, slow, relentless, and quiet. This is how Texas death row begins. Not with execution, not with headlines, but with a transfer that removes an inmate from the world and places them into a system designed to never let them forget where they are. Life on Texas death row, the routine that never changes. Once the transfer is complete, life on Texas death row settles into a routine that is both rigid and relentless. There are no surprises, no variation, and very little flexibility. Every hour is controlled, every movement monitored, and every privilege tightly regulated. For inmates housed under the authority of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, routine is not about rehabilitation. It is about containment, order, and predictability. On death row, predictability replaces freedom. A day begins before the inmate is awake. The day on Texas death row begins early, often before sunrise. Inmates are awakened not by alarms, but by sound. The echo of boots in the corridor, the rattle of keys, and the opening and closing of food slots. There is no personal control over wake-up time. Lights may already be on, depending on unit policy. Count procedures occur multiple times a day, sometimes with officers visually confirming the inmate's presence through a small window or slot in the door. Breakfast arrives without conversation. A tray is pushed through the slot. The door remains closed. Once the tray is delivered, the officer moves on. There is no lingering, no small talk, no explanation of the day ahead. Meals are eaten alone inside the cell every single day. The cell is the entire world. The death row cell is not designed for comfort. It is designed for durability and control. Most cells measure only a few feet across. The walls are concrete. The bed is fixed. The sink and toilet are combined into a single stainless steel unit. There is limited storage, often just enough space for legal paperwork, a few books, and personal letters. For inmates, this cell becomes more than a room. It becomes a boundary of existence. There is no walking to chow halls, no shared recreation yards, no casual movement through corridors. Time is marked not by clocks, but by events, meals, counts, showers, and rare recreation periods. Days blend together. Weeks lose definition. Months pass with little to distinguish one from the next. Recreation and isolation. Recreation on Texas death row is not what most people imagine. When allowed, inmates are escorted individually from their cells, placed in restraints, and taken to small, enclosed recreation areas. These spaces are often surrounded by high walls or fencing, offering no clear view of the outside world. Recreation is solitary. There are no games, no group activities, no social interaction. Inmates may walk in circles, exercise, or simply stand in silence. The duration is limited, and the schedule can change without notice. Some inmates use this time intensely, performing repetitive exercises to exhaust their bodies. Others barely move, conserving energy in an environment where physical exertion serves no practical purpose. For many, recreation becomes less about exercise and more about breaking the monotony of the cell. Communication and control. Every form of communication on death row is regulated. Mail is monitored. Letters may arrive weeks after being sent. Some content is restricted or censored. Outgoing mail is inspected as well. Phone calls, when permitted, are limited and often recorded. There are strict rules governing who can be called and how often. Missed calls are rarely rescheduled. Visits are among the most emotionally complex aspects of death row life. In Texas, death row visits typically occur behind thick glass. There is no physical contact. Conversations take place through phones, under constant supervision. The visit ends when time expires, not when the inmate is ready. For many inmates, visits are both a lifeline and a source of pain. They offer connection, but also reinforce distance. Loved ones age. Children grow up. The inmate remains in the same cell. Medical and mental health care. Medical care on Texas death row exists, but it is limited by security priorities. Inmates are escorted to medical appointments individually, restrained at all times. Mental health evaluations may occur through the cell door or in controlled settings. Psychological distress is common. Long-term isolation, combined with the constant awareness of execution, creates conditions where anxiety, depression, and emotional withdrawal are widespread. Some inmates experience hallucinations. Others develop severe insomnia or panic disorders. While treatment is available, it is often reactive rather than preventative. The system responds to crisis, not deterioration. For inmates, asking for help can feel risky. Any change in behavior may be documented, interpreted, or used to justify additional restrictions. Discipline without escalation. Unlike general population units, death row rarely sees traditional prison conflicts. There are no fights in day rooms, no gang activity, No territorial disputes. This is not because inmates are less violent, but because the environment makes conflict nearly impossible. Discipline on death row is administrative. Infractions may result in loss of privileges, reduced recreation, restricted property, or delayed visits. Physical force is rare, but the threat of further isolation is always present. Compliance becomes a survival strategy. Time as the primary punishment. On Texas death row, time itself becomes a punishment. There are no programs to work toward, no release dates to anticipate, no milestones that signify progress. Appeals move slowly. Years may pass between court decisions. Some inmates spend decades in the same cell, under the same conditions, waiting for outcomes beyond their control. For some, hope shifts from freedom to delay. Every postponed execution date becomes a temporary victory. Every denied appeal becomes another reminder of how limited their influence truly is. The routine does not change, regardless of legal developments. The silent community. Though inmates are housed alone, they are not entirely unaware of one another. Sounds carry. Voices sometimes echo through vents or down corridors. A shouted comment, a cough, or a distant door slam can remind inmates that others are nearby, invisible but present. This creates a strange, silent community. Inmates may recognize each other by voice, by routine, by the timing of movements. Yet direct contact is rare or non-existent. Relationships form without faces, built only on sound and shared circumstance. For some, this offers comfort. For others, it deepens a sense of confinement when routine becomes reality. Over time, the routine becomes internalized. Inmates stop expecting variation. They stop asking questions. The system teaches them what to anticipate and what not to hope for. The structure of death row life is designed to remove unpredictability, but in doing so, it also removes meaning. This is not an environment meant to rehabilitate or prepare inmates for reintegration. It is an environment designed to maintain control until the end of the legal process, however long that takes. The weight of knowing. Perhaps the most defining aspect of life on Texas death row is not what inmates do, but what they know. They know the routine will not change. They know the cell is permanent. They know the system does not bend for emotion. And they know that at some point, the routine may be interrupted, not by freedom, but by a date. That knowledge sits quietly in the background of every day, unspoken, unavoidable, always present. The waiting game, appeals, dates, and the weight of time. On Texas death row, the passage of time is not measured in days or months. It is measured in court decisions. Once an inmate has settled into the routine of death row life, attention slowly shifts away from the cell and toward the legal process. This process does not move quickly, and it does not move predictably. For many inmates, it becomes a central focus of existence. Appeals are not just paperwork. They are lifelines. How the legal process continues after transfer. A death row transfer does not mean the legal process is finished. In fact, for many inmates, the most complex legal phase begins only after they arrive. Cases are reviewed through multiple levels: state appeals, federal habeas corpus petitions, and in some cases, requests for clemency. Each stage can take years. Each decision requires extensive documentation, legal research, and argument. The system is slow by design. For inmates housed under the authority of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, this waiting period is indefinite. There is no clear timeline. Legal teams may file motions, but courts are under no obligation to respond quickly. An appeal can sit untouched for months, sometimes years. During that time, nothing changes inside the prison. Life paused by the courts. From the outside, appeals appear procedural. Filings, hearings, written opinions. From inside a death row cell, they feel deeply personal. Every piece of mail from an attorney carries weight. Every update or lack of one becomes significant. Some inmates obsessively reread court documents, searching for meaning in legal language. Others avoid the paperwork entirely, overwhelmed by complexity and implications. Hope, when it exists, is fragile. A single denied appeal can undo years of optimism. A granted review can reignite belief, even when the odds remain overwhelmingly against the inmate. Yet regardless of progress, daily life continues unchanged. Meals arrive the same way. The door stays closed. The routine does not acknowledge legal milestones. This disconnect between the gravity of the legal process and monotony of daily life defines much of the death row experience. When an execution date is set, at some point, if appeals are exhausted or denied, the process reaches a turning point. An execution date may be scheduled. In Texas, once legal avenues narrow, the state can move relatively quickly. Inmates may receive notice weeks or months in advance, sometimes less. The exact timing varies, but the impact is immediate. The abstract becomes real. The date is not delivered dramatically. It may arrive as a document, a notification through legal counsel, or an official notice from prison staff. There is no ceremony. Once a date is set, everything changes, even though nothing physically changes at all. The psychological impact of a date. The presence of an execution date reshapes time itself. Days that once blended together suddenly feel numbered. Every routine activity becomes framed against a countdown that cannot be ignored. Some inmates withdraw further, limiting communication and contact. Others reach outward, writing letters, requesting visits, making phone calls whenever possible. Sleep patterns change. Appetite fluctuates. Anxiety becomes more pronounced. Psychologists who have studied death row inmates note that this phase is often the most psychologically intense. The uncertainty that once defined death row life is replaced by certainty, and certainty carries its own burden. Even inmates who claim acceptance are affected. The mind responds whether the inmate wants it to or not. Legal efforts intensify. Once a date is set, legal activity often accelerates. Attorneys may file last-minute appeals, emergency motions, or requests for stays of execution. New evidence, if available, is presented. Arguments that failed before are sometimes reframed and resubmitted. This flurry of activity creates emotional turbulence. Hope spikes, then collapses, then returns again. Each court decision becomes urgent. Each denial carries more weight than the last. For inmates, the cycle is exhausting mentally and emotionally. Some inmates choose not to pursue further appeals. Others fight until the final hours. There is no single response. There is no standard reaction. The role of clemency. In Texas, clemency represents one of the final possible interventions. Clemency requests are reviewed by the Board of Pardons and Paroles, which may recommend commutation or reprieve. The governor holds significant authority in this process, but approvals are rare. For many inmates, clemency is seen as a long shot, a possibility rather than plan. Still, applications are submitted. Statements are written. Families hope. The prison environment does not acknowledge this process. There are no announcements, no visible changes in treatment. The inmate waits, time under a countdown. As the execution date approaches, routine becomes heavier rather than lighter. Meals taste the same, but feel different. The cell feels smaller. The silence feels louder. Inmates become acutely aware of every sound, every delay, every movement outside the cell. Some keep track of days manually. Others stop counting altogether. The body reacts in unpredictable ways. Some inmates experience heightened clarity. Others experience confusion or emotional numbness. Memory becomes sharp for some, fragmented for others. This period is often described as existing in two realities at once: the physical routine of death row and the mental reality of what is coming. When dates are delayed, not all execution dates proceed as scheduled. Stays may be granted hours before an execution. Courts may intervene at the last moment. New evidence may surface. Legal technicalities may halt the process temporarily. When a stay is granted, relief is immediate but incomplete. The date disappears, but the possibility does not. Inmates return to the same routine, now carrying the knowledge of how close they came. For many, this experience permanently alters their perception of time and hope. Some describe it as a second sentence, one that resets the waiting process without offering resolution. The weight of uncertainty. For inmates without execution dates, uncertainty is constant. For those with dates, certainty becomes crushing. Both states carry psychological weight. On Texas death row, time is not neutral. It presses inward, shaping thoughts, routines, and identity. The legal system operates at its own pace, indifferent to the mental toll of waiting. For the inmate, there is no escape from this reality. They wait for courts. They wait for decisions. They wait for time to move forward or stop entirely. The point of no control. Perhaps the most defining aspect of this phase is the loss of control. Inmates cannot influence court schedules. They cannot accelerate appeals. They cannot predict outcomes. The system holds all authority. For some, this leads to resignation. For others, resistance. But for all, it reinforces the central truth of death row life. Control has been fully transferred to the state. The waiting game is not just legal. It is psychological. And it reshapes every moment that follows. When the waiting ends, final days on Texas death row. When the waiting ends on Texas death row, it does not end loudly. There are no alarms, no sudden announcements, no visible shift in the unit's daily rhythm. Instead, the change is quiet, procedural, and unmistakable to the person experiencing it. Once all appeals are exhausted and no further stays are granted, the system moves forward. At this stage, the inmate status changes again, though nothing about the cell itself appears different. The walls remain the same. The door still closes the same way. But the meaning of time changes completely. Notification without ceremony. In Texas, inmates are formally notified when their execution is scheduled and confirmed. This notification is delivered through official channels, often via legal counsel and prison administration, and documented as part of the process. There is no emotional framing, no explanation, no discussion. It is not delivered as news. It is delivered as procedure. From that moment forward, the inmate enters the final phase of death row life, a phase defined by irreversible certainty, increased observation. As the execution date approaches, observation increases. Correctional officers conduct more frequent checks. Mental health staff may evaluate the inmate more regularly. Every interaction is documented. Every deviation from routine is noted. This heightened attention is not personal. It is institutional. The system is ensuring compliance, stability, and readiness. Despite this, the inmate's physical environment does not become more humane. The cell does not change. Privileges are not expanded. Comfort is not introduced. Normalcy is maintained deliberately. The final day's routine. In the final days before execution, routine becomes paradoxical. Everything remains the same, yet nothing feels the same. Meals arrive as usual. Showers occur on schedule. Recreation, if allowed, follows the same restrictions. The door continues to open and close without explanation. But each action now carries weight. For some inmates, this routine becomes grounding, a familiar structure in the face of certainty. For others, it becomes unbearable, a reminder that the world continues while their own time is ending. Sleep patterns vary widely. Some inmates sleep excessively. Others barely sleep at all. Anxiety often peaks, though outward behavior may remain controlled. This is not chaos. It is restraint under pressure. Final visits. One of the most significant aspects of this phase is the opportunity for final visits. In Texas, death row inmates may be permitted a limited number of final visits in the days leading up to execution. These visits are heavily regulated, supervised, and time-restricted. There is still no physical contact. Conversations occur through glass, under observation. The rules do not change, even now. For families, these visits are emotionally overwhelming. For inmates, they are often a mixture of connection, regret, and restraint. Many choose their words carefully. Others struggle to speak at all. Some inmates decline visits entirely. There is no single response to finality. Legal activity until the end. Even as the execution date approaches, legal efforts may continue. Attorneys may file last-minute motions. Emergency appeals may be submitted. Requests for stays can occur hours before the scheduled execution time. For the inmate, this creates an unstable emotional landscape. Hope resurfaces, briefly, then fades, then resurfaces again. Each development is communicated through controlled channels. There are no guarantees, no reassurances. Until the moment the execution proceeds, uncertainty remains, but only barely. The legal system does not stop moving until the final moment. The night before an execution is often described as the longest. Silence deepens. Sleep becomes elusive. Thoughts turn inward. Some inmates spend the night writing letters. Others pray. Some remain awake, staring at walls they have known for years. Officers maintain their posts. The unit remains operational. Other inmates on death row continue their routines, aware, often by sound alone, that one their own is nearing the end. There is no public announcement inside the unit. The system does not pause. The final morning, on the day of execution, the inmate is awakened early. There is no dramatic language used. Instructions are clear, brief, and procedural. The inmate is informed that the process is beginning. Restraints are applied. Movement occurs under escort. At this stage, the inmate is no longer treated as part of death row housing. They are transferred internally, away from their cell, away from the routine that has defined their existence. For many inmates, leaving the cell is one of the most emotionally intense moments of the entire process. It is the last time they will see the place where they waited. The execution chamber process. The execution chamber in Texas is designed for efficiency, not spectacle. The inmate is secured to a gurney. Lines are placed. Medical staff carry out their roles under strict protocol. Witnesses assemble behind glass. Throughout this process, the inmate remains under constant supervision. Final statements, if offered, are voluntary. Some inmates speak. Others remain silent. Once all procedures are complete, the execution proceeds. Time of death is recorded. Documentation is finalized. The process ends. Afterward, after an execution, the death row unit returns to routine almost immediately. The empty cell is processed. Belongings are handled according to policy. Records are updated. Other inmates continue their day. There is no memorial, no acknowledgement, no pause. This is not indifference. It is structure. The system is designed to absorb finality without disruption. The perspective from the inside. For inmates who remain on death row, executions are reminders of proximity. They hear doors. They notice timing changes. They understand what those sounds mean. Some respond with increased anxiety, others with withdrawal, some with resignation. Executions reinforce the reality that death row is not theoretical. It is operational. Finality as policy. The final phase of death row life in Texas is not designed to provide closure for the inmate or for those left behind. It is designed to conclude a process. From transfer to execution, every step follows policy. Emotion is neither encouraged nor acknowledged. The system prioritizes order above all else. This is how the waiting ends, not with chaos, not with spectacle, but with procedure. What Texas death row represents. By the time an inmate reaches the end of death row in Texas, the system has already done its work, not just legally, but psychologically, institutionally, and socially. Death row is often discussed in terms of crime and punishment, guilt and innocence, justice and deterrence. But inside the system itself, those debates fade into the background. What remains is structure, a structure built to manage finality. Under the authority of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, death row operates with consistency and control. Every stage, transfer, isolation, waiting, execution, follows established policy. Emotion is not part of the design. This is not accidental. A system built on certainty. Texas death row is designed to eliminate unpredictability. From the moment an inmate is transferred, variables are removed one by one. Movement is restricted. Contact is limited. Routine is enforced. Over time, even uncertainty itself becomes regulated. This structure serves the institution well. Predictability reduces risk. Control minimizes disruption. Efficiency ensures continuity. But for the inmate, certainty takes on a different meaning. Certainty means knowing the cell will not change. Certainty means knowing the routine will not soften. Certainty means knowing that time does not lead anywhere except forward or to an end. This environment does not ask inmates to reflect or reform. It asks them to comply. The human cost of isolation. Long-term isolation is one of the defining features of Texas death row. While intended as a security measure, its psychological consequences are well documented. Human beings are not designed to exist without sustained social interaction. Over time, isolation alters perception, emotion, and cognition. Inmates describe losing track of time. They describe emotional flattening. They describe moments of detachment from reality. Some adapt by building strict internal routines. Others retreat inward. A few resist, maintaining mental engagement through reading, writing, or faith. But adaptation does not erase impact. The longer the isolation lasts, the deeper its effects become. Families on the outside. Death row does not exist in isolation from the outside world. Families remain connected legally, emotionally, and psychologically, even as physical contact is denied. Visits behind glass, monitored phone calls, delayed letters, these become the only points of connection. For families, time moves differently. They mark years by appeals. They remember milestones missed. They prepare for outcomes they cannot control. Some families maintain hope until the end. Others prepare for loss long before it arrives. Many exist in a constant state of emotional suspension. Death row does not sentence only one person. The perspective of the state. From the state's perspective, death row represents authority and final judgment. Texas has long defended capital punishment as a legal response to the most severe crimes. Officials emphasize procedure, due process, and adherence to law. Every execution is framed as a conclusion of a long judicial process. Within this framework, death row is not a moral space. It is an administrative one. The system does not weigh emotion. It executes policy. This detachment is necessary for the system to function. Without it, consistency would be impossible. Justice versus closure. One of the most persistent questions surrounding death row is whether it provides closure. For some victims' families, execution represents an end point, a moment when legal proceedings finally stop. For others, it brings no relief, only another form of loss. Inside the system, closure is not a goal. The process ends because it must, not because it resolves grief. Death row is efficient at ending cases. It is not designed to heal. Life defined by waiting. For inmates who remain on death row, life continues under the same conditions, regardless of what happens to others. An execution does not change the routine. A stay does not improve conditions. A new appeal does not alter the cell. Waiting is the constant. Some inmates wait decades. During that time, the outside world changes completely. Technology advances. Laws evolve. Society shifts. Inside the cell, nothing moves. This disconnect creates a unique form of temporal isolation, being alive in a world that no longer exists for you. The irreversibility factor. One of the most debated aspects of capital punishment is irreversibility. Appeals exist to prevent error, but no system is infallible. Once an execution occurs, there is no correction, no revision, no second look. Texas death row acknowledges this risk through procedure rather than pause. The system attempts to be thorough, not cautious. This distinction matters. The emphasis is on finality, not uncertainty. What the transfer ultimately means. Looking back, the death row transfer marks the true beginning of the end. Not because execution is immediate, it rarely is, but because the inmate's role in the system changes permanently. They are no longer an inmate serving time. They are an inmate waiting for an outcome. Everything that follows flows from that moment. The transfer removes choice. The routine removes variation. The system removes ambiguity. A system that continues. Texas death row will continue to operate as long as capital punishment remains law. Transfers will occur. Appeals will be filed. Executions will proceed. The system does not slow down to reflect. It does not pause to reconsider its impact. It exists to carry out a mandate. Whether that mandate represents justice or something else depends on perspective. Final reflection. What really happens after a death row transfer in Texas is not dramatic in the way popular culture suggests. There are no constant confrontations, no daily chaos, no cinematic moments. Instead, there's control, there's routine, and there is waiting. The transfer marks the point where life becomes process, and where time itself becomes a punishment. For those inside, death row is not a headline. It is an environment. And once you enter it, everything that follows is shaped by that single moment, when the doors close and the waiting begins. Death row in Texas is not defined by a single moment, not by the crime, not by the trial, and not even by the execution. It is defined by what happens after the transfer, after the doors close, after the routine sets in, after time stops feeling like time at all. Behind the walls operated by the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, life on death row becomes a system of waiting, measured not in years, but in decisions made far away from the cell. Appeals filed, motions denied, dates set, dates delayed. For some inmates, that wait lasts decades. For others, it ends sooner. But for all of them, the transfer marks the moment when life becomes process, and the future becomes something they no longer control. Texas death row is not loud. It is not chaotic. It does not need to be. Its power comes from routine, isolation, and certainty. And long before an execution ever happens, that system has already done its work. This documentary was not about taking sides. It was about understanding what actually happens, beyond the headlines, beyond the courtroom, and beyond the myths. Because once someone is transferred to death row in Texas, everything changes. Quietly. Permanently. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe.